My name is William Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute. I also want to acknowledge Bernd Reindl, who's from the German consulate, and the consulate very kindly has helped support this event, so thank you. Many of you know about Leo Baeck Institute, although I've talked to some of you who've come in, and some of you are newer than others. And I've got a problem here, Andreas, is my paper sat on your computer, and now your PowerPoint seems to be moving forward, so you might have to, I'll hit escape. How's that? The Leo Baeck Institute was founded in 1955, and our mission has remained consistent for what will be 60 years, to promote the study and preservation of the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. As such, we have a world-class research library and archives that contain a significant collection of source material relating to German Jewish history, from its origins to the tragic destruction by the Nazis, and continuing to the present. Our collections examine and record periods of enlightenment and emancipation, as well as the destruction of German Jewish life in Europe. But our work doesn't stop there. What I've been looking at since in my 2 years at the Leo Baeck Institute is how we can also address some more contemporary issues, and that also will bring the history alive. That brings us to Jews and the Berlin Wall. 25 years ago, the wall came down. While this is obviously an important moment in history, why look at it from the perspective of Jews? I know that our panelists will have a lot to say about this and how the wall had an impact on the Jews, the events leading up to the wall, the time that Berlin and all of Europe were divided, and what has happened since the wall fell. We have pulled together a distinguished group of panelists, and their bios are in your program, so I'm not going to repeat them. But first, I want to report, sadly, that Jeffrey Peck, the dean of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, suffered an injury last night that, while not threatening, he will be fine. He's forced to be in bed rest. So I want to thank Frank Mecklenburg very much for substituting as the moderator. Many of you know Frank. He's been at LBI for 30 years, first as our archivist and then our director of research. He has a PhD in history, several books, and many articles to his credit. But beyond that, he is the institutional memory, the reality check, and much, much more at LBI. In addition, Frank has lived in Berlin before, during, and at times after the wall, so he certainly has a firsthand knowledge of the topic. I deeply appreciate the fact that Frank is stepping in for Jeff. I'm also pleased that we're joined by Michael Brenner, Professor of Jewish History and Culture at the University of Munich, Seymour and Liliane Abinson Chair in Israel Studies at American University, and President of LBI International. So he's got several titles. I had to take a deep breath. And Rabbi Andreas Nachama, who was a former leader of the Jewish community in Berlin, and currently the executive director of the Topography of Terror in Berlin, a museum that, for those of you who haven't been to Berlin, is a must-see. Liliane Weissberg is the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor in Arts and Sciences and Professor of German and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania. All of our panelists have lived through, studied, and written about these events, so I think we're in for a treat. So please welcome them.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this very nice event. So we have heard a lot about in past weeks about the fall of the wall and the German East-West split, and that was overcome in 1990. And so the title, The Berlin Wall and the Jews, doesn't lend itself to a topic as it seems, but when we go back in 1945, there was 250,000 Jews in Germany, and Berlin was the largest Jewish community and under great threat from the post-war Cold War situation. How has the split in East and West influenced also life of Jews in Germany, this is something that has not been looked at in all of these festivities that have been come up. You probably read in the New York Times various articles, and so the situation of Jews after 1945 was something that was very much in question. Many people didn't understand why there was any Jewish life left in Germany and in Berlin. And the wall, of course, manifested the split between the world in East and West even more. And this, of course, had also an influence on Jewish life in Germany. And so we have three distinguished speakers today who will give us a lot more detail on the situation, certainly up to the point that the wall was built, and during the time of the split, developments in East and West, and what kind of manifestations did we find from this, for instance, in the cultural sphere. Liliane Weissberg will tell us more about that. And Andreas, Rabbi Nachama, will tell us from his very own perspective, having lived in Berlin, having been a leader in the community, and this is something that nobody can tell us better than him. Michael Brenner has written about German Jewish history in many, many publications, and in that sense is the best person to give us a broader view, but also having lived in Germany at the time, and so we can really get it from three experts that nobody else. So I'm calling Rabbi Nachama up to introduce us to the topic, and then we will have the following two speakers, and following we will have a brief panel discussion and then open up to your questions. Rabbi Nachama, please.
Well, what I'm going to tell you is not so much something about what I expect, what I experienced as. Would this come somehow to? Okay. It's still not slideshow here from the beginning. Good, here we are. What I'm going to tell you is not so much about the time when I was president of the Jewish community, but much more about my childhood, the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. So, yes, Berlin was a rubble heap near Potsdam, as you can see it here. Almost everything was destroyed. Almost everything was in a mess. Let me stop this here. Pause. And what you would see is, yes, it was a city of four powers. And the city was divided from the very beginning. Divided because, let's take it in the words of my mother, who survived hidden in Berlin, that the 2 years from the Fabrikaktion to May 1945 were not as hard as the 2 months from May 1945 to July 1945, when the American troops came to Berlin. That means the Soviet occupation was a horrible time, a nightmare, not only for the Germans, but also for the few Jews that survived. It was a nightmare because rape and thief and everything that you can expect was subject of everyday's experience. Now, that was the situation, and the next point that you should know is there was one rabbi surviving in Berlin, hidden, not hidden, as on the Jewish cemetery. He did most of the funerals in the time of the Third Reich. When these people died that have been hidden somewhere, and then those people brought the dead corpses to the cemetery, and he did the funerals. The Gestapo knew that, and they tolerated that. So he somehow was maybe the only official Jew in Berlin during the last 2 or 3 years of the Third Reich. Riesenburger then became a rabbi in Berlin. He was officiating in the East and in the West until 1961. I will later tell you something about it. If we speak about Berlin in 1945, 1,500 Jews survived hidden, another 1,500 survived in mixed marriages, and some 3,000 arrived in Berlin in June, July, August, and September 1945. Most of them were liberated on the death marches. Some of them were liberated in camps, and they were on their way to the West. They made a stop in Berlin, and the stop in Berlin was made possible by the United Nations Refugee Rescue Association that tried to bring these people out of Germany in 1945 onwards, and they arrived in Berlin together with American combat troops in July, August 1945. And then you all had a situation when you had also, like what you see here, you had shops of Holocaust survivors, of the camps, of the communist, socialist survivors, who tried to help these people out and who tried to help themselves. I mean, somehow this is the situation. Here you see, for instance, a synagogue in Berlin with garden chairs. So this was one of the synagogues which was somehow not destroyed. The other one you see here, it's the Riekestraße, the synagogue in East Berlin. Both of these synagogues were not destroyed because they were surrounded by other buildings, and were surrounded by other buildings, and that's why they have not been taken down. I don't know why. I don't know why that does it like that. Wait a minute. Go out. Why does it do that? I don't know. I should have taken my computer. It would have been easier. Anyhow, the situation in Berlin was difficult for all. And the first president of the Jewish community, Erich Nielhans, was a permanent guest of the American Jewish army chaplains. And he helped some Soviet soldiers out with American uniforms. That means he helped them to escape from the Russian army to the West. This somehow is an important point in his life, but because he was taken then by the Soviet secret police and ended up in a camp somewhere in the Soviet Union. And from that moment onwards, the Jewish community in Berlin, even without war, was split into two fractions. The fraction that believed in the communist system, and those who did not believe in that, and that was a majority. So you had also an invisible wall long before the wall was erected. Here you see, for instance, a service in the Harnack House that were the American liberators, autumn 1945, And you see the number of participants, all American GIs, all American servicemen. They played an important role by the rebuilding of Jewish life in Berlin. What you also have to know is that here, for instance, you see Riesenburger on the left side. That's the rabbi who survived and who was actually functioning in both East and West Berlin. But the most important thing for the Jews in Berlin was the joint. Here you see two women in front of the office of the Berlin Joint, or you see here the joint gifts. That means Jewish life in 1945, 1946 was dependent on the aid from the outside because there was hardly any food and anything. Or here, for instance, you have the first Seder after the war, with a Jewish fantasy flag in the center because the state of Israel in 1946 did not exist. Here you see the Chaplain Center with a Jewish welfare flag, which was a center for the rebuilding of Jewish life. Or here you have Guyani visiting the DP camp, the camp of displaced persons in Berlin, which had some 6,000 places, and these were needed for Jews fleeing from the first pogroms from Poland, November, December, January 45, January, February 46. So this played an important role because they could stop here and then they were flown out by airplanes of the American army to the west. Or here you see the first Holocaust memorial in Berlin. It's also on the camp of the displaced persons in Schlachtensee. So that's the situation given. Then the start of the Cold War. It's a way into division and to a division of two communities. You see here, for instance, people in the streets demonstrating, showing that they are present, Jewish survivors that showed in the public that they are not dependent on the communists and that they are somehow really trying to start own organizations which are not dependent on the Communist Party or on the Red Army. This is Neelhans, the first president. I already mentioned him. He was taken to a camp of the NKVD. He survived hidden in Berlin and then ended in 1949 or 1950 in a Soviet camp. This here is Julius Meyer. Julius Meyer used to be the secretary of the Jewish community, and he became a member of the East German Parliament in 1949-50. And as you probably know, there were trials against Slansky, against other so-called anti-Zionistic trials in the Eastern Bloc. And when on the 17th of June 1953, East German workers protested against the communist regime, it was very quick that the Soviet system blamed the Jews for that. So Julius Meyer, who was secretary of the Jewish community and a member of the East German Parliament, had to flee to the West. And in the West, he then decided to move on to Brazil, where he died in the 1970s. Here you see how the people from the camp, from the United Nations camp, the UNRWA camp, were taken out by airplanes during the blockade of Berlin. So the planes brought in food and other stuff, and when they were emptied out, they took out the Jews from the camp, which somehow singled the Jewish community out to be the only Jewish organization in Berlin. Here you see 1948, East Berlin, the flag of the State of Israel in front of the Gemeindezentrum. So yes, in this time there was, even though it was almost a split Gemeinde, a community that was split into two, there were still links between them. Then you had East Berlin since 1953, when after the upheaval of the 17th of June, two communities emerged out of that. One in the west, one in the east. And the east one had a president who was at the same time member of the Communist Party, SED. And let's take it that way. In the east remained 800 Jews. In the west were something between 5,000 and 5,200 Jews. So the majority of the Jews voted for the west, and only a minority remained in the east. And that's the situation. Here you can, this is just one title page of a little pamphlet that they were editing in the East, just to tell you that there were really two independent communities. They had their own synagogues, they had their own system of being member, but it was still possible to go from east to the west and from west to the east, because until 1961 there was no wall. That means Rabbi Riesenburger, for instance, officiated in the west and in the east, or my father, the Chazan, Stronger Nachama, officiated without any difficulties in both parts of the city and in both communities. Both communities had political actions. On the left side, you see Riesenburger and the president of the East German parliament. That's on the left side. And on the right side, you see Heinz Galinski, the chairperson of the West Berlin Jewish community, with Konrad Adenauer, the chancellor at that time. So in a way, both systems tried somehow to have the Jewish communities as partners, or whatever you would say in a situation like that. Here you see Hanukkah 1953. That's an important point, because Nachama on the left side and Riesenburger on the right side were lighting the Hanukkah candles, and they were doing it together. That means even though these two communities have split up, there were still links between them, and at least the rabbi and the cantor were officiating together. This changed dramatically in 1961. In 1961, the wall was erected and everything was cut off. There were only less than 500 people in Berlin who came from West Berlin and had a work permit for East Berlin. There was almost everything was doubled. 2 banking systems, 2 water pipe systems, everything was cut off, and in a way, out of one city emerged 2 cities, 2 communities. Everything was separate, except that Stronger Nachama, who had a Greek passport because he was originally a Greek citizen, and Greece was one of the World War II winners, so there was a Greek military mission in Berlin, and they had access to all 4 sectors, so he could go via Checkpoint Charlie to East Berlin, and he got a work permit for East Berlin, so he could do the funerals. And this was an important link. And I'll tell you about one story. The funerals were there were no telephone connection between East and West in the 1960s. You could not phone. So when they had somehow an appointment that funerals in the East would take place at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So the funerals that he had to do in the West, he would do it until 12, so he could go over to the next funeral. One day he gets a wire telling him tomorrow funeral at 9:30. So immediately he knew that something is going wrong. Went there very early in the morning. What was it? Yes, there was an attempt that the shochet of the Jewish community in the West should also officiate in the East, because he was a British passport holder. He could probably go over the border, but the East German president of the Jewish community, the one with the party connection, heard that he originally came from Hungary, and there's an investigation against him that will take him into custody because it was said that he fled from Hungary in 1956. He did not do that, but later, when the wall was down, we looked into the files and we found out that there was another person with the same name, not the same birth date, but the same name, that they had seen. So yes, there was a connection far beyond working together. There was a connection also to tell people, be careful at that time, don't do this or don't do that. There were warnings given in a situation when you had no telephone connections. This was sometimes difficult. Or another story, which was taking place also in the 1960s, after Riesenburger has died. Zeiger was a secretary of religious affairs in the East German government. There was a Hanukkah celebration. My father would go there. I was also there present. I was 15, 16 years old. And the president would shout at my father and would tell him, Loi mit dem Aleph, Loi mit dem Aleph. What is Loi mit dem Aleph? Loi mit dem Aleph was for him especially difficult because he was a Sephardi. He would not understand the Yiddish sense of it. Lo, it means no in Hebrew. But the Aleph means it's really the no and it's not him. So he understood that he had to say to something no. So the secretary is going to meet him and to welcome him, and he would ask him, Nachama, what do you think? Does a Jewish community really need a rabbi? My father would immediately say, I don't need a rabbi. They disturb my service. They interrupted with the sermon. I don't need that. But he heard before the Lo Aleph, the Lo, don't say that, from the president. And he understood, yes, the Riesenburger has died. Do they need a rabbi? That means a rabbi somehow has to be imported from somewhere. So he said, no, a Jewish community is not possible without a rabbi. It's the most important person, and without a rabbi, you're not a Jewish community. And so Ödem Singer came for a couple of years from Hungary to Berlin to act as successor of Riesenburger. But that's the kind of story you have to understand. These people in the Jewish community were not really connected to the state. Yes, they were connected, but they were connected in order to make Jewish life somehow possible, not to destroy it. And they used this in order to do it. So the impression that the Western press, and also Heinz Gerlinski, the president of the Jewish community in the West, had that these are all agents of the Communist Party, on first sight, that was probably the case. If you really looked behind the scene, you could see that they really tried to get more room and more possibilities for the Jewish community. So here, for instance, you see the yearly concert on around the 9th of November, around Kristallnight in the synagogue of East Berlin, with a choir from East Berlin, so they would learn Hebrew songs and stuff like that. You would also see then in the later years, Yalda Rebling here, for instance, with her band, that beside or next to the Jewish community, even somehow as part of the Jewish community in the East, cultural activities arose, like klezmer music, like a library in the Gemeinde, which was a really little cultural center, and things like that. And the community as such felt as if they were a little family. Here you have 1987, when the wall was not so close anymore, that what was his name? His name was Neumann, was introduced as a rabbi, an American rabbi, to Isaac Neumann, to the community in 1987. Then, when it came to almost to an end with the Eastern Bloc, the GDR, the East German government, discovered their Jewish communities. You see Honecker, the Generalsekretär, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and first man in the state, and Kirchner, the president of the Jewish community at that time in the East, and he got something as a present. That was the attempt that the East German government thought that the Jewish world would like two Germanys much more than one, united, Fourth Reich, Viertes Reich, and so that here also Adassis Roye, the Jewish community of the Jewish community that somehow has faded away after 1938 or 39, was re-established. Offenberg, the president of it, or Secretary General of Adas, here received something from Honecker, from the Secretary General, and they were re-established as one of the first acts in December 1989, shortly after the wall was down, by de Maizière, the later Prime Minister of East Germany, into their old rights. So the East German government really, up to the end, made politics with the Jewish community. I mean, no question, that was part of politics, but it was somehow something where the Jewish community still had room for own activities. And that room for these own activities somehow where their services was, as far as time was going on, cultural activities, and were also contacts to the West. So there was a little Jewish gate in the wall, but it was very limited, and somehow it was really difficult to get through. So at that time, I would like to end, and later we have the possibility to come into discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is not easy for me to be up here because it confirms the realization that I have become historical in some ways. So I don't know what to do with this, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal experience in Berlin, and that will continue chronologically after Andy Nachama's story, although I have to say Andy was talking about a time when he was not born or then very small, because I remember him very vividly as a doctoral student of history in Berlin when we both were very active in the Jewish student organization. Ladies and gentlemen, there isn't one Berlin. And I'm going to talk to you today about three different Berlins, two of which I encountered concurrently, and the third one I encountered a little bit later. And there isn't just a relationship between the Jews and the Berlin Wall. There is a relationship between the Jewish community, and Andy Nachama has talked about the organization, the Jews who were organized in a Jewish community, and what can be called simply Jews, Jews who are not part of a community in an organizational sense. And let me explain to you something that may not be obvious to American citizens. In Germany, unlike the United States, you pay a general church tax. This church tax is not a contribution that you pay voluntarily or non-voluntarily to your own synagogue or church, but the money is taken out of your salary, it goes to the state, and the state redistributes it to the religious organizations. That has a side effect. The side effect is that your religious affiliation in terms of religious community is part of your tax record. If you seek employment, you come with your employment papers, and there is written member of the Catholic, Protestant, Jewish community, or whatever you choose. That is after 1945, or was after 1945, not a great vision in the positive sense for many survivors. Many were underground long after the end of the war. And so not everybody who was a member of the Jewish community before the war returned to it or returned to it right away. And not everybody who calls himself a Jew and who goes to the synagogue is a member of the Jewish community. I'm just saying this in advance so that you may be able to understand my distinction between the three communities I'm going to talk about today. The first one is the separate community. The second is the secret community. And the third one is the new community. I encountered the separate one in 1972. I was just 18 years of age, and I was going to college. And where does a leftist young woman go to college? Leftist young man too. They go to Berlin. Why to Berlin? Well, if you're a young man, you didn't have to go to the army. You were not drafted. Berlin was the city of youth. There was a large retirement population, but everybody who wanted to do business or worked in industry didn't remain in Berlin. Berlin had the oddest population figures. A lot of older people who stayed there in retirement, a lot of younger people who came there to avoid the draft, to go there to study and so on. Very little in the middle range. What does it mean for young Jews? Jews did not have to go to the army. Still they don't have to, but meanwhile there is no draft in Germany. But going to Berlin meant to be primarily with a new generation in a young city that on the one hand was the former capital of the German Reich, but secondly filled with young people, especially in the West, that's what I'm going to talk about first, who did not perhaps have the same kind of links to the past. And if you look at the student uprisings in 68 and 69, you have in Europe the city of Paris and the city of Frankfurt, but primarily also the city of Berlin. So in 1972, belatedly, as always, I'm always a little bit late, but I had to finish high school first, I went to Berlin. Under great consternation of my family and my family friends who lived in Frankfurt, because at that time it was still customary for the children to emigrate in the state of their parents. The parents found themselves in Germany after the opening of the DP camps, after coming out of hiding. They returned to Germany out of private reasons, but they wanted at that point still in the early 70s, for the children to emigrate and have the life that they didn't want to, whatever you fill it in, there were multiple explanations, didn't want to do, couldn't do. So you spoke of that generation as a generation on packed suitcases. And most of my fellow Jewish friends, and I have to be a little bit cautious here, growing up in Frankfurt, sizable community. I was the only one of my age. You have to kind of learn to know what sizable meant at this time. You knew basically everybody, if not in person, then by name. You went abroad. You went abroad to discover another form of Jewish life. And there was the Weissberg daughter moving to the former capital of Germany, studying literature, among which German, it was already rumored, my native language was German, terrible thing to do. Moved there instead of emigrating and was a leftist. And to make things worse, she was a leftist and regarded herself as a Jew. So she was a leftist who was trying to discover the Jewish community in Berlin. And ladies and gentlemen, this can be compared to discovering a happening. I arrived in Berlin. About a month later, I was made the head, the president of the Jewish Berlin Student Organization. Very few people do it. Do it is fine. I still had my Berlin map in my pocketbook and tried to find out what the hell I was supposed to do. Two of the people I contacted first, who were also fellow students I had met, one was Mario Offenberg, who blamed me, and we just talked about it, and shouted at me as a good leftist. What the heck was I doing in the Jewish community? This was the West. I should join the anarchists. Mario Offenberg, by the way, is today the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in West Berlin. The other person who reacted equally strong was a person called Leon Bieber, whose family returned, I made a mistake, from Chile, I thought first Bolivia, and studied at the Institute for Latin American Studies. He looked at me and says, "Haven't you learned your lessons? Never return to the Jewish community." He, in the meantime, returned to Chile. So what you had is not only the division that Andy has depicted between Jews who were leftist, even communist on the one hand, and Jews who were not. You even had in the West the kind of discussion among the youth, should one or shouldn't one, now not to color the hair, but to become a member of the Jewish community. And once you decided you wanted to become a member of the Jewish community, and I thought it would be a good idea, after all, I was running the student organization for them now, I was a little bit baffled which part, because the West Berlin community was split as well. It was split between the German Jews who had survived in hiding, returned from Palestine or America. It was in Berlin that I have not only met for the first time German Jews, but actually met a family who celebrated Pesach on pre-war China. I had to phone my parents immediately to tell them that. And my mother's question, of course, was, and what did they serve? And I was truthfully saying shrimp. And my mother said, "Oh, those yakkers." And that was the end of the story and my discovery of the family. It was the family of Michael Wolfsohn, by the way. So I was a little bit confused about how this functions. If you were at the one Brit loge, you couldn't be at the other, and so on. So I thought, it is weird, but I'm going to get used to it. But going to get used to it had another problem. You see, as a revolutionary, 18-year-old, you didn't want to be out-revolutioned. And they were not only those people who were more leftist than I were and not part of the Jewish community, or blamed me for this, but still keeping track. There were also Jews, especially the German Jews, who had professions or jobs I had never experienced before. Just imagine if you are sitting on packed suitcases, You could become a business person. You could become a doctor. Maybe a lawyer under certain circumstances. But there are some jobs you would never do as a Jew. Cab driver, custom official, civil servant. I called my parents again. Just imagine, I had a Jewish cab driver. My mother just pretending, not really Jewish, can't be. That was the answer. I didn't know how to deal with this. And I realized there were German Jews who had a very different experience with their city, not only than I had with Berlin, but that I had with the whole of Germany. It was their city and their country, whether I was, on the other hand, just adopting it. My family was the normal German family who came from the East and in the next generation became Jewish. These were German. These were families who came from the East but were already 2, 3, 4 generations away from their Eastern roots, therefore could become civil servants and cab drivers. And then I decided, well, you know, this is a community, but this community had a very separate life from the life that I encountered at the university. I learned very quickly that I was part of the Jewish community, but I wasn't flaunting it. I never told my fellow students I was Jewish. That was okay. I learned this from home. Again, my mother, very strong woman. For all of those who don't have one, Jewish mothers are always very strong. She says, if you want to listen to Jewish music, turn it low. So I turned it low in every sense when I went to classes. I turned it low when I met people. And there was a little bit of, if you want to say, a masquerade. You were Jewish when you entered the offices in the Fasanenstraße, where there were events and so on, and you were Jewish in the Jewish student organization, and you were Jewish when you came to America for the very first time on a trip of American Jewish organization supporting the poor few European Jews. I didn't understand why we were poor and few. There were at least 500, 400 young people in Germany, and I knew for sure in Norway there were less, because I knew somebody in Norway who was going to Copenhagen to study to get a larger community. So I didn't understand this, but that was fine, and I knew to keep the identities separate. And then I thought maybe it's different over there. Over there meant in the East. The East was not always closed. The East was open for 2 kinds of population segments. The old people. If you were older than 65, you could go forth and back without any problems. So you had a lot of grandmothers and grandfathers coming from the East to see their Jewish families in the West. And if you held on to a non-Berlin identity paper, and I did. I had a West German one. If you had a non-Berlin one, you could easily cross the border. Not everywhere, but at a lot of stations. So it was not only that you had to be Greek or British, you could be West German. That was a different country as well. You just had to know where to go, and you went to Friedrichstraße. And I went over there to the East, and there I had another sort of happening that was very interesting. I got my monthly newspaper from the East German Jewish community. You saw the cover letter, the cover there. What you didn't know is that Martin Riesenburger wrote a sermon and a speech every month for the paper. And this was a little bit troubling, knowing that he was dead for quite a while. So I found out that there was a way the East German community dealt with the lack of rabbi. They didn't let him die. That means on paper he was dead, but practically Rabbi Martin Riesenberger gave his speech every month to every holiday, it was circulated in the paper. It was a little bit confusing, however, when you didn't know it, and I was just always late, I mentioned this, and went over there to meet the rabbi with the wonderful speeches, and I was told there's a cemetery. And the cemetery was known to me because that is the large Jewish cemetery that was on the east side. The west didn't have a cemetery when the wall came up. The other thing that was very interesting to me is that I started to attend the services in East Berlin because even though I'm a woman, I thought, they were in lack of a minion and they were also in lack of people. I should go over there. I became friendly with many people in the community. And I realized there were three distinctions. One was to be Jewish, and one was to be a victim of fascism. To be a victim of fascism is an official designation. And that was something that was very useful in the East. Many members of the Jewish community had little dachas on the Müggelsee, or they had preferable treatment in one or the other ways as victims of fascism. But to be a victim of fascism doesn't necessarily mean that you are Jewish, and doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say that you are Jewish. So the East had a flourishing community of Jews who were not Jews and not Jews who were Jews, and you kind of had to figure out who was a victim of fascism and Jewish and not. And when you went to the events, there were always people running the community and the events, but then there were also people who were not in the community but had the influence. And that, for example, became very poignant for me when I seemed to recognize a person at one celebration, and I turned to my friend, our common friend, Hermann Simon, and said, I think I know this guy. And he looked at me and says, yeah, it's Markus Wolf, the head of the Secret Service. So what you had were people in the government who did not want to be members of the community, but were kind of putting their hand over the community. So it wasn't just the official agreements made, it was also that kind of political understanding. And that was very interesting because most Jews in West Berlin, despite the split, were of Eastern European descent. Most Jews in the East were of German descent. But most Jews in the East came to the East out of their free will from emigration. This is not what generally happened in the West. They came to the East to build up another country. They were there, at least in the beginning, because they were convinced that this is the better Germany and they wanted to do their bit. So there you had Jews at the university, you had Jews in the government, you had Jews everywhere, except few, and except they were not in the community. And this is why I call it the secret community. And it took me a while to figure out why my friend Hermann Simon would not know my friend Marian Kant, would not know my friend Barbara Honigmann, and insist they all didn't know each other. One was the daughter of a government official, the other one of a famous journalist in the GDR, the other one of a university professor. It was especially striking because they all went to the same school class. And I thought, how can they all sit in the same class and not know each other? And then sometimes after dinner, you will find out that one of them said, oh, well, Barbara Honigmann was in the bench before, but she never said anything. And I said, well, that is striking to remember of a person whom you do not know. So this is the secret community. And the third community that I encountered is the community after 89. And that community is totally different from the West and totally different from the East. And I encountered it by returning to Berlin often as a visiting professor. I was living in the States already in 89, and teaching both at the Humboldt and the University of Potsdam. And there you had the following situation. After 89, the floodgates opened. If you call this floodgates, I don't know how you call it. One is a gate in the wall. The other one was a gate to the former Soviet Union, to Russia, of Jews being invited to come to Germany. There's a lot of questions whether the people who left and the people who arrived were the same, whether the people who arrived were Jews. There are halakhic questions, because in the former Soviet Union you had to designate ethnicity in your passport. Some had a Jew in the passport. That is not the same way as the Jewish religion designate Jews, which goes according to the mother side and certainly doesn't go like 5 generations on the father was Jewish. But there was also a trade for Jewish passports. My mother, who was still alive at that time, if she would have known how often I quote her, she would be very happy. My mother was alive at the time, and she was extremely happy because my mother survived under false papers. She survived as an Aryan, and everybody she knows survived under false papers as an Aryan unless they were in the camp. Here, where suddenly non-Jews buying passports to become Jews, to go out west. She thought this was the best thing that ever happened to history, the buying of Jewish passports. And in the end, it probably doesn't matter if the children go through Jewish education and so on. And I have absolutely no problem. So don't ask me about that. But the situation was different in the sense, first of all, of integration. A community of a few thousand, 5,000 maybe, had to integrate an immigration of 10,000 or more. This is not how integration functions. The people who came, moreover, had as a rule no sense of Judaism, or very little, or didn't know where to start. And a community that in itself was already unclear why they were here or what they were doing had suddenly to teach them to be Jewish. So the community today is largely Russian, largely learning how to be Jewish. And most of them, once they have a certain economic level, are leaving again. Leaving again not Germany, but the community, as are the German Jews, the so-called German Jews. The Eastern Jews are now the German Jews. The German Jews who have a certain economic level because they figure out taxes, I don't have to pay them. This is not my community. But there is, in terms of culture, something else that is the most dramatic switch. The Jews in West Berlin, the Eastern Jews, were marked by their past in the DP camps. The Jews, part of the Jews in the West, but most of them in the East, were marked by their broken German history and their return. The new Jews have absolutely no relationship to the Holocaust. They came to Berlin, they have no idea of or they are learning about the German past, but they are traumatized by Stalin. They're traumatized by the Soviet history. So they have a totally different relationship to the surrounding. So suddenly you have bagel stores, unbelievable before. You have kosher-style restaurants. You have klezmer musicians since '89, most of them not performed the music not performed by Jews, most restaurants not owned by Jews, but trying to put a Jewish culture in place that has now become visible. And the other thing that happened after 89 is the rapid immigration of foreign Jews, mainly from America, but also from Israel. All of those are not members of the Jewish community in the formal way, but marking the question of Jewish life. So in many respects, you will find a Jewish Berlin now that has no relationship with the Jewish Berlin I experienced as a young woman, and may in some respects be much more like the life you know in New York than the life of post-war Germany. Thank you.
This is a hard act to follow, both of them, but I have to thank both of the previous speakers because they have already gone through almost all of the aspects relevant, so I can be really short and brief. Let me say first that my story is a little different from both of the previous speakers. I did not grow up in Frankfurt or Berlin, but I am what would have been called before 1933 a Landjude, a rural Jew. I grew up in a small town in Bavaria, and I didn't grow up in the shadow of the wall, but in the shadow of the Iron Curtain. It was about 10 miles from the Czech border in a small town called Weiden. It's the town where in 1945 about 1,000 Polish Jews stopped when they, mostly survivors of concentration camps, left Poland after liberation, May 8th, 1945, came to their hometowns, found out no one survived, went westward. Where could they go? There was no Israel. The Americans didn't let in many immigrants, so we go to the American zone. My father was among this group. They stopped first in the very first little town, about 50,000 people, and there were about 1,000 Jews just about 10 miles from what would soon become the Iron Curtain. Most of them, of course, went on, and once Israel was founded or when the immigration restrictions were lifted in the United States, left the small town and left Germany, and there were about 50 Jews maybe left in that town when I was born in the mid-60s. They were all, it was like a little shtetl transplanted into the middle of Bavaria. All Polish Jews, besides my mother, who actually, Andreas' father, helped her to escape in 1952 from Dresden through East Berlin and to West Berlin. My aunt, who came back from Bolivia, but they were the two Yekes, the others were all East European Polish Jews. And you heard only Yiddish in the Jewish community. They were not religious. They were not Orthodox, with one or two exceptions, but the services had to be very Orthodox. I remember there was a big mechitza, a big separation wall. The women didn't see anything. My mother, who had as a child gone to the famous Semper synagogue, the same architect who built the opera, built the synagogue in Dresden, she hated it, and my grandmother as well. But the Polish Jews were used to this kind of very Orthodox shtetl-like synagogue. No one really kept kashrut, kept kosher, kept Shabbat, but once, a few days in the year you went to the synagogue, it had to be very Orthodox as they were used from their youth. It was a peculiar community. You already mentioned what the professions were. Actually, in that small town, and maybe I simplify a little, but more or less, I think we distinguished between what was called the Schmatologen. These were usually people like my father who had a textile store, and actually on the high holidays, the little center of the town, most of the stores were closed because it was Jewish holidays just before 1933. And the others, they were called the Barone. They had their bars. A bar, of course, was just another bit nicer term for like some kind of red light district establishment, usually with the American soldiers in town or around town. So these were the two groups. I grew up, and that was, of course, similar, just more extreme than what Liliane said before. I was the only Jewish kid in school. There was only one other Jew always in the classroom. It was good Catholic Bavaria. He was on the crucifix on the wall, so I didn't feel totally alone. And I remember the first day of school, the teacher said, I was 6 years old, and the teacher says, who is Catholic and who is Protestant? And I thought it was something different. But I went home, and my mother, as you described, Jewish mother, very upset, came to school and said, you can't ask this question. There are other things. That was before the big Turkish immigration, and I remember later in school, there was the first Muslim, he was Persian. That was in the most exotic one in the small Bavarian town. It was written, they were still written in the annual, in the report every year. The profession of the father was written, and the religion of this poor guy was, it said, OB, ohne Bekenntnis, without religion. That was even worse than anything else. Things have, of course, tremendously changed. That was in the 60s and 70s. So, in a way, it was a very small Jewish community. It was a community that was clearly on the verge of dying out. And in fact, in the mid-1980s, I think the preparations were already underway to merge with another small community, also mainly Polish Jews, close to this place. And no one would have expected, of course, what happened on November 9th, 1989, and the consequences we heard already. Things turned out very differently. No one knew that yet on November 9th, 1989. In fact, I was in New York. I just had started my graduate studies at Columbia, and I think probably I was that day at the Leo Baeck Institute, where I just started working as a graduate student with Frank Mecklenburg, and still on the Upper East Side, of course. And I remember my mother called and said the wall came down, and I had it wasn't internet yet, so you didn't hear it in the same moment. And I thought, wow, couldn't they choose another day than November 9th? It was, of course, where everyone thought of Kristallnacht, or maybe the Hitler Putsch in 1923, or the end of World War I and the German kind of revolution in 1918, but of course mainly 1938. And here we go, another event happening that day, the fall of the wall. But none of us would have thought that there would be any major positive, I would say, life-saving consequence for German Jewish life. A few months later, the first Jews actually came. So I wasn't in that small town anymore, but my parents were, and my mother still had very close connections to the Dresden Jewish community, and they called and they said, we have these, because many of them came first to the east from the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union let people out, they came to East Germany, and they said, we have these Jewish families here. Would you want to take some in the West? And my father then was the president of that small community, said, sure. And there were the first two families who arrived in 1990 in the small town. And soon there were more to come. And the plans to close down the community or merge with another one did not happen. And now they were talking of building a new synagogue, because within a few years, the community had grown from what was left, about 35 Jews, to about 350 Jews. It also, and I think I'm just mentioning that example I know best because it represents many of the small Jewish communities. There were still about 70 or so small Jewish communities in Germany, but most of them were, as this one, it was just a matter of time until then when they would actually die out. So it was not just a matter of survival, it was also a different Jewish community that emerged. Within a few years, of course, most of the Holocaust survivors from Poland had died, and the new generation wanted something different. They tore down the mechitza, the separation between men and women, and in fact, that community became the second in Germany to employ a woman as a rabbi, and they had now a much more active Jewish life than ever before. With a small community of 50 people, there were usually only services on the holidays. Now, every Shabbat, you had services in that small town. In other small towns, the development was sometimes even more dramatic. New synagogues were built, new community centers, new Jewish schools were built in some of the bigger communities. So all of these developments came, I think, as a total surprise for German Jewry, who somehow thought Jews in Germany would still exist, but only in some major cities, maybe Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich, and Cologne, Düsseldorf. So that changed the landscape and the nature of German Jewish life, both in numbers, because had they not come, demographers say probably today there would be something like maybe 12 to 15,000 Jews in Germany. Now, no one knows the exact number. The members of communities is about 105,000, but there may be twice as many living in Germany, among them not only former Soviet citizens and their children, but of course, as we heard about, who knows, 20, 25,000 Israelis in Berlin. We don't know because they don't come with their Israeli passports, but with the German or Hungarian or Bulgarian or other EU passport, which they get through their parents or grandparents. So we have also a revival in terms of the inner life of German Jewry. There are now several rabbinical seminaries of all denominations in Germany, something quite unimaginable when I grew up there. I was a student in the 1980s at the first college for Jewish studies established by the Central Council of Jews in Germany in Heidelberg, which still exists, but they would not, you could get a the idea was, well, ultimately they would educate rabbis and cantors and teachers, but what happened is that about 90% of the students there, as in all other Jewish studies places in Germany, were actually non-Jewish. So not many rabbis and cantors would come out of there. So things have really dramatically changed, and I think in 1989, many of the Jews in Germany, as they would call themselves, and still do, were not so enthusiastic about the fall of the wall. Jews in Germany, and I think we heard from both the other speakers a little bit about the feelings they had. They were not enthusiastic, mostly living in Germany. They had somehow ended up there. They didn't plan to stay there. They knew what would protect them in a way is the bad conscience of the majority of the German population, the Allied presence, and the wall. As terrible as it sounds, but I think, and you mentioned that quote, I think it was the French writer Mauriac who said that first, I love Germany so much that I wanted two of them. And many German Jews were so cautious and so frightened that Germany, I mean, like Margaret Thatcher or François Mitterrand at the time as well, that they had internalized that. And I think things have changed dramatically, and I think most German Jews today, for several reasons, are quite, I wouldn't say happy, but very positive about the fact that East Germany disappeared and there is one united Germany. First of all, East Germany, of course, never, as Liliane said, never recognized Jews really as, in the same way as victims or fighters against fascism. They were victims of the second class. They did not get reparation in the same way Jews in the West would get. And of course, they were very hostile, the government was very hostile towards Israel. So all of this, of course, has changed. And in a way, the fall of the wall guaranteed or brought about this revival of Jewish life in Germany, which I am a little skeptical still about, and we heard that before too, how much it will continue in the future. But certainly it made Jewish life in Germany possible for the last 25 years and certainly for the next generation or 2 or 3 as well. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes to have a little exchange between us and to maybe touch on some questions that didn't come up. I'm very curious about the cultural production. The split in East and West had different sensitivities and insights into German history and German Jewish history, and how did Jewish life express itself during those years, and in comparison, of course, also with today, but in the situation where the wall really divided everything, was there a common voice, or were there different voices, and how did this reflect on what we see now? And maybe Liliane, as a literature person, if you want to start.
I can start, but maybe not right away with literature. The community in the West was, of course, very small, and they thought they could best defend their identity and integrity by being what is called an Einheitsgemeinde, a community of unity also in the religious way. And Micha had already explained that the service in Weiden was Orthodox. Well, the service everywhere was Orthodox. And the few synagogues that survived in Frankfurt, the main one, had an organ. It was a Reform synagogue. You didn't play the organ anymore. You had Orthodox service. There was, of course, the exception with the Pestalozzi-Straße again, where Andy's father was a cantor. So you had Orthodox service, you didn't have the variety. If you wanted to convert to Judaism, you couldn't do it in Germany. You could have instruction by the rabbi, but you had to go to Israel to convert. You could, of course, convert with the army rabbi in Heidelberg or elsewhere, but it wasn't really recognized, because it wasn't Orthodox. So there was a very strict safekeeping on what was Jewish, and being a member in the community felt like keeping safe and alive. So it wasn't just, as Micha has said, the bad conscience of the surrounding, although that was certainly the case, but also the question of the community always being a whole. When there was a wedding, you didn't invite 2 or 3 people, you invited 300, 500, because after the war, everybody was your family, and you wanted to show the solidarity for the community as a whole. In the East, it was very different, because the community did not secure a safety. It was a risky thing to be a member of the community. So weddings usually were, well, there were hardly any. There was, I think, 1 bar mitzvah I knew of. And so that was just not the case. In the West, when you wanted to be underground, you put, as I mentioned, the music a bit lower. You had your culture in the Jewish community quarter, but it didn't go beyond this. You had, of course, singers who claimed they were Jewish, authors who claimed were Jewish, people who collected money for a Holocaust memorial with a clearly Hebrew name. But you knew these were not Jews. Micha has outed himself that his father had a schmatter shop. My parents, huh? Nice schmatter shop, yeah. My parents had, I have to say, a nice jewelry shop. That's the difference of the places. The Munich surroundings were mainly textile. The Frankfurt had different sort of business. And I have to quote my mother again. My mother said, I got to buy Magen-Davids because those Germans just buy them. So the gold Magen-Davids were not worn by Jews. They were worn by non-Jews. And if you had a singer with the name Katja Epstein, or a person who was collecting money for the Holocaust memorial called Lea Roche, you knew they were not Jewish. They just pretended. So you have a culture of imaginary Jews that flourished until 1989, to the extent that I visited one of my publishers who changed her name to a Jewish one, you know who that is, and put a basket with matzot in front of me and said, take one, we eat this. It was not Passover, so I was a little bit puzzled. So I said, are these matzot? So she says, yes, yes, these are matzot, they were in my family. Now I know that what her name was before she became, well, I don't want to call name, but you know, this is all, it was pretty silly. After the fall, in the East it was very different. In the East you tried to keep some German Jewish identity in an oblique way, in the service, where everything was pronounced according to the German Ashkenazi way. I had not heard this before. In the West, everything according to the Eastern Jewish pronunciation. In the West, in the East, everything according to the German pronunciation. And you had a few people trying to do folk songs and so on who were actually Jewish. I couldn't believe it. So that was happening there too. So that was the paradox. And after 1989, you had again, at first, in Berlin, the imaginary Jews. I mentioned the bagel shops and the klezmer music. You had very successful tours through Jewish Berlin done by a young man whose father was in the SS, and he tried to kind of compensate. And I was very worried about this. But what has happened meantime is that many of the Russian immigrants have started to make their own music, to write. So one person who became very popular is Vladimir Kaminer, who runs a Russian disco in Berlin and writes comic novels, and so on and so forth. So you have now, as a matter of fact, Jewish life by Jews. Only they're not members of the community, and they are not the same Eastern European Jews. My parents and the people I know were Eastern European Jews, here with me from the big city, from others from the shtetl, who were not from the Soviet Union. These are Soviet Jews. And I think one thing the Jewish communities didn't realize, that there would be ex-Soviet Jews coming. I think they thought it was more of the same, and it wasn't.
And they were bringing a different culture to Germany, yes. But during the time of the wall, I mean, Andreas, how did you experience Jewish expression other than religious? Cultural. The film industry, there were some Jews there.
Wait a second. There was Atze Brauner. There was Atze Brauner in Berlin, famous in the film industry. He off and on had parties. I was tutoring his kids. He was off and on having parties where he invited Jewish actors from abroad, but he was making money with Heimatfilme, with movies about the Bavarian landscapes and so on. It is only late that he tried to do a film about Janusz Korczak or other Jewish history. So that is not Jewish culture. Sorry.
I would see it like that. I mean, that was Jewish culture. I mean, that was Jewish folklore somehow. I mean, these people in the West and in the East, you had people who were in the, let's say, cultural business, active in the cultural business. And they, as a matter of course, they tried somehow to have their dreams. And their dreams were normally not Jewish dreams in the sense that a rabbi would be happy about that. But their dreams were to be a film mogul, as Atze Brauner. Their dreams were to be one who produces records in the pop music and things like that. And you had people who, let's say, even in the East, had businesses. I mean, my friend Hans Rotholz, he's still around, had a shop for toys, where you could also buy toys. You could buy there more or less everything in the East. So the point is, yes, you had people in the cultural business. They came in, and if they came in, they made their way, but it was not primarily a Jewish way. I mean, you had the guy, I forgot his name, he had this famous TV show on the Bembel. No, with the Bembels. Heinz Schenk, exactly. I mean, he was not Jewish. Yes, he was Jewish, but yes, of course. No, Hans Rosenthal is another story. Take Hans Rosenthal, it's another story. Hans Rosenthal was a person that did TV shows for a large audience, was one of the most popular TV persons in Western Germany. But and he was active in the Jewish community, but he never brought that together. I mean, that's the way they did it. They had their business sector, and they had their sector where they were Jewish, and somehow that was in most of the cases strictly divided in the West and in the East.
Maybe I can add to this. I think to survive in television, radio, and so on, you couldn't play up your Jewishness. Everybody knew. It may have helped, but you couldn't play it up. There was a kind of understanding. But there were also two kinds of people in the culture industry. One was somebody like Hans Rosenthal, who survived in hiding. Since 1945, he was back officially in Berlin and then entered the radio business and TV. But there were also a lot of Jews who, by the Allies, got licenses to run certain businesses because they had no Nazi past. So the film business for Atze Brauner was an accidental thing in which he entered because he got the license to use the studios. So that is very, very different from somebody who wants to do cultural production. It was business.
Yeah, Michael, your experience from the shtetl.
Well, I actually lived in Berlin in the early 90s. I think things were really different then. Actually, starting at that point, people, and you mentioned that before, even no matter if they were actually Jewish or not, tried a lot to display their Jewishness. And the same with writers, some better, some worse, but at some point starting in the 1980s and certainly in the 1990s, so certainly after the wall came down, but I don't think necessarily related to that, there was this whole wave of huge interest in everything Jewish, which to a certain extent still exists, but I think it is, which is natural, it is going down. And that was certainly a phenomenon. When I came back from not temporarily, whatever, in the 1990s from the United States to Germany and lived in Berlin for a while, that was a change compared to the time before. Another change was actually something which was not mentioned. There was also new fear. If you remember the scenes of Rostock, Lichtenhagen, and some other very ugly scenes around in the early 90s, which were not directed against Jews, but against foreigners, that was something which also worried the Jews, of course. And you would find the spokespersons of the Jewish community usually marching in front of these protests against the xenophobic new developments in the early 1990s.
Which is actually amazing that in all of what we were saying, the word anti-Semitism has never shown up, and maybe the wall was also an element that kept that at bay in a way, and there were lots of other minority populations already pre-1990. And, but I think this may be a good moment to open up to the audience and to ask questions if you want to address any of the speakers.
In today's tablet is a very long article about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Germany. I read it on the way. I couldn't read it that closely, but it seemed to be quite a remarkable account of that subject. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Germany now.
Well, I could answer it that way. If I'm asked about anti-Semitism in Germany, I would always say it stopped on the 8th of May 1945, and it's restarted on the 10th of May or 9th of May 1945. That means, but that the in between, you have to make a distinction. Until the 8th of May 1945, it was an anti-Semitism that was the Shoah. I mean, that was radical. It was the majority of the society. It was done by the government. The anti-Semitism on the, let's say, 10th of May 1945, from that day onwards, is an anti-Semitism that if it really shows up in the public, it is not accepted. And it is, let's say, if a mayor of a provincial town somewhere in Germany turns out to be an anti-Semite, it's the end of his career. So there is a difference between it, but it has never been away. And if you look to polls that they did over the last 40, 50 years, you have people who are potentially anti-Semitic always between 20 and 25%. I mean, and there's no real difference between 20 and 25% if you look, it's constant. Anti-Zionism is another question. Is I would say primarily the most anti-Zionist people, and also by number the strongest fraction of anti-Semites, come from with a Muslim background. So that is, let's say, something that has been imported from the Middle East or from other Muslim countries to Germany. And that is something which is comparatively new. It's comparatively new that also the Turkish people turn out to be more and more anti-Semitic. That is, in that sense, new that, let's say, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, that was not the case. So, yes, there are also new scenes of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism developing. But if I speak about, let's say, the population with a German background, I would say it is, yes, present, but not really something that you would carry in front of you. If you do anti-Semitic remarks, they are more in the shadow, on the backside of an article or so. You know, they're not open. That is not open. It's nothing to be proud of, or it's nothing to say it's no problem, but it is, let's say, much less violent than before May 8th, 1945. And in France, and it's also different than in Poland, where you have an anti-Semitism without Jews, but that's another question.
I basically agree with what Andreas said, but I also think what I noticed more now from outside, because I have been in Washington the last year or 2 years, clearly there was something going on last summer which worried not only the Jewish leaders, but a lot of people in the community, and it was a certain, I mean, not just anti-Zionism and anti-Israel, but a lot of using of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish stereotypes with this. And what I noticed is that the leaders of the political strata in Germany, the show, all the famous people, they come out and they speak out against. There was a big demonstration at the Brandenburg Gate a few weeks ago, organized by the Jewish community, where the chancellor was there and the president was there, and I think the president of the Supreme Court, but only about 9,000 people showed up, many of them Jews. So that was so you don't have this outcry anymore in the middle of the population protesting these phenomena. And the other thing which comes to my mind, and that was when I was in Germany, and I must say I had never encountered so much hostility. It was about 2 years ago during the discussion about circumcision in Germany. And there was a large movement, both from the very left but also from the right, to outlaw circumcision. And what I noticed, and I was invited to speak like to the Green Party fraction in the Bundestag and others, and I noticed that a lot of people who you think were quite educated, first of all, did not know that Jews actually circumcise their little boys. And the second thing, they always conflated circumcision of boys with girls, which is a totally different story. But the aggressiveness in this was shocking to me, and I had personally not experienced. That was when the then president of the Jewish community said, this is something we'd never encountered. So there are certain things, and that was an instance, as Andreas knows better than I, as in your work in the Berlin Jewish community, where the Muslim and Jewish leaders, of course, found common ground because they worked to defend circumcision and also ritual slaughter.
Maybe I can add to this, because I think a lot of remarks that are done against the Jews are not really against the Jews, but against the Muslims and the Turkish. The problem, and I say this now in quotation marks, and it's difficult to speak quotation marks, but the problem in Germany now is not the still small Jewish community. Jews are regarded more or less as Germans of Jewish faith. I say more or less. But the question that is discussed again and again is whether you can truly integrate the Turkish population. And some of the discussion has a language that is extremely troublesome. Some of the discussion is blurring the lines, and I think the whole reaction against circumcision was not because of Jewish circumcision, but because of Turkish circumcision. So a lot of this is blurring it. And I think the worrisome point is now Islam and the Turkish population, and not at all the Jewish one. That has, however, great consequences for Jews. For example, in the academic study of Judaism, you have mentioned all the new yeshivas and so on, but a lot of professorships for Jewish studies are now put in question whether or not one has to rededicate it as professorship for Islamic studies or move on to another topic. The number of Germans who study Judaism or Jewish studies is not as high now as it had been years ago, and there is a rise in funds for the study of Islam, and the government is very consciously sponsoring it. Now, we can understand why, but the point is we have to make sure that the interest in Jewish matters is not forgotten.
I would just add a little thing. I mean, I was very frightened by the circumcision debate, but we have to see it also in a broader context than only anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish. It is anti-religion. And in Berlin, you have a majority of people that are not belonging to any of the churches. You have a majority that is without any religious denomination. And that is something which I find as one of the consequences of the falling of the wall, because the East was anti-religious as such, and this was a state policy in the GDR, in East Germany, and now it has become much more common to all people. It's a part of the new Germany's feeling to be anti-religious, and with that, also anti-Jewish, but in that context. So there is a real change in the attitude towards churches and synagogues and mosques.
And that is perhaps...
I think we should allow a couple more questions. Yes, over there. Sorry. Hold on 1 second.
Thank you very much. A question and an addendum. The question is, do you have to go from Germany to Israel, or could you go to Basel, Switzerland, or to Switzerland and get for conversion? Because there you have the Einheitsgemeinde, which are conducted in an Orthodox way, and so you could probably get converted in Basel or in Switzerland by an Orthodox rabbi. And the addendum which I have is about the Star of David. The Star of David is not 100% guarantee that something is Jewish. Number one, you find quite a few people from Latin America who have necklaces with Mogendowitz. I saw them at the City University and other places. There you can find them. And secondly, and even more prominent is, in Basel you have a cathedral. And the cathedral during the Reformation was converted to Reform Christianity from Catholic. And the window, the glass window, has a huge Mogendowitz. And the reason is the delta, it's two deltas put on each other, and Jesus stems from the house of David.
May I answer, because these were two remarks I made? No, it was Jewish. What has happened is there was a great discovery of Jewish grandfathers. So a lot of people were thinking, well, maybe my grandfather was Jewish, or maybe he came from the Netherlands. Why did he come from the Netherlands? Probably he was Jewish. Not necessarily that the stories made sense, but there were a lot of, how should we say, there was a wish among many Germans to discover Jewish ancestors. That is the second answer. The first answer is a part of the procedure. Of course, you can study to be a Jew anywhere. In Basel, in Paris, in London, that's not the issue. But the ritual in Germany is that you took instruction with a German rabbi, but then went to Israel for the examination. So this was a way of dealing with it.
But it's history. Today, the Orthodox Rabbinical Conference has a Beit Din, and the Reform or the Liberal Conference has a Beit Din, and it's history. Yeah, it's history. But the Star of David, I mean, you also have breweries in Bavaria that have a Star of David on
But
their...
you know why?
That's,
Because it is the sign for equal measure.
Yeah, but that's so. The Star of David is not always a sign for a Jewish institution. I was very surprised when I was a student 30, 40 years ago, when I came to Bavaria and I saw a brewery with a Star of David. So I thought, maybe it's a kosher beer brewery, but it was not. It was not
Always kosher.
Yes.
But it's true. I mean, the Star of David, of course, became a Jewish symbol really relatively late in history, as we know. You can go to, I mean, there are mosques which are older with Stars of David symbols. But I think today
it is.
For the last, certainly, probably 100 years or more, it is a Jewish symbol. So when you do it in Germany, people know why they
And
use
especially if you give the reasons why you want it.
But I think it's an important point to mention that it's not always Jewish.
I want to say something about the circumcision that you brought up. In 1966, 67, I was a teacher in ancient Antakya, Turkey. And in the school, they had a celebration, and I found out that the principal was providing a party for two young children of the woman who was working there. And I happened to ask a fellow Turkish teacher about circumcision. When were you circumcised? So he said he was 20 years old. So I say, why was that? Why were you circumcised when you were 20 years old? And he said, you can't get circumcised unless you have a big party. And we don't understand that here in this country. All right, every 7 days a Jewish boy is circumcised. And I said to him, is that true all over Turkey? So he said, yeah, all my friends, the rich ones, were circumcised when they had a party. And I had to wait till I was 20 years because my parents were poor. And that's true about the whole country. Circumcision has to do with how much money you have.
Well, maybe on that note, we take one more question, and
Hi, I have a question which is a bit touchy. I do remember the demonstration in Berlin this summer when people were coming out with signs, death to Israel. I mean, it was on TV. And basically, the people were immigrants from Palestine, from the West Bank, war refugees. So there's not only a big Turkish community, there's also a big Arab community in Berlin, and especially a big Palestinian community. So the Jewish community has always been very outspoken pro-immigration. In hindsight, had there been a mistake? So.
Had they been?
The Jewish community was always very pro-Muslim immigration to
just
Germany.
The last word, what was
so, it? Has there been a mistake? Should you have been more cautious?
A mistake, okay. No, I mean, first of all, Berlin almost got a Palestinian mayor, right?
Yeah, I know.
I mean,
almost,
but
yeah.
that doesn't mean, I think, obviously, there isn't one opinion in the Jewish community. There are 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And the same is true in Germany as well. You had public voices in the Jewish community which were very much, they basically have 2 choices. You have the choice to be part of the establishment society and kind of line up against the other, which is the immigrant and the Turk and all the ones who come to Germany. Or you say, well, we have been here now for we, the Jews, have been here for thousands of years, but we, the post-war Jews, have been here for also 70 years. Or you say we are part of the other. And that is the big difference of the Jewish community in Germany after, say, the 1960s, 70s, that they're not the only non-Christians anymore, as they used to be before the war. So most Jewish leaders, I think, understood that well, and they therefore supported a society which is colorful, which is multicultural and multinational and multi-religious and so on. But there were also others. You had someone like Ralph Giordano, who is a writer in now probably in his late 80s, 90, who was one of the spokesmen against building a mosque in Cologne, and in a way went together, although he's not a right-winger, went together with the right-wing, extreme right-wing, which I personally thought was wrong. And but you clearly have an increasing number of Jews in all over Europe who are, and in America too, by the way, who are turning more towards the right. And that means also different attitudes towards immigration. And you even have right-wing parties, not in Germany, but you have some of the European right-wing parties which try to appeal to a Jewish, to Jewish voters, like in France, say, you know, we have a common enemy, our enemy's enemy is our friend, and in a way they say we hate the Muslims even more than we hate the Jews. So there is that segment too. I think some Jews are tempted to, I would say, fall into that trap, but overall I think it is good, and there is no other option for a European society and for Europe to even survive without immigration. And forget the Jewish question. I mean, if you don't have immigrants in Europe, you can close down very soon.
Yeah, but does it have to be immigrants from Arab countries? That's really the question.
But I mean, as a former politician in the field of Jewish communities, I remember very well when, for instance, the Senator of Interior Affairs of Berlin said it will take decades to re-Germanize certain districts of Berlin because they're looking so Turkish or so Arabic or whatever. And I spoke as a matter of course against it. I mean, how can you other than be against positions which would lead back to Volksgemeinschaft? And we all know what that means. That means certain people are in and other people are out, and we know how it is to be out. So this can't be the option. The option is not to be against immigrants or to be against certain other religions or whatever. The question is whether European societies form and integrate these people in a way that the options for terror and for intolerance of their side is no option anymore. And that is what we have to do. And if you ask yourself how so many students of schools in Germany or in other European countries now are fighting with IS, then we have to ask ourselves, what did we do wrong? And I think what we did all wrong, be it in America, be it in the Americas, be it in Europe, is that we single them too much out. They have the idea that they're not part of the European society. And that brings them to terror and creates a lot of problems. The problems of the Middle Eastern politics, that's another field which is completely different and which has to be seen under other aspects. And I tell you one thing, not in the Americas and not in Europe. In the Middle East, these problems have to be solved, unfortunately, and that will take a long time.
On that note, thank you very much, and please keep following our calendar. We have many interesting programs, and we'll welcome you again, I hope.